For over 700 years, these homes stood open. No doors, no guards, no warning signs. They were not abandoned ruins. They were ancestral homes, connected to living communities whose descendants still exist today. Then humans returned. And within a single century, they were forced to close them. Not because they were destroyed, not because they collapsed, but because human presence alone was enough to make them unsafe. Entire sections were sealed. Access was restricted. And one ancestral dwelling was closed completely. This is not a story about an ancient site failing. It is a story about living heritage that survived perfectly until we stepped inside. So what exactly did humans do that made these homes impossible to enter again? To understand that, we need to take a closer look at this place. At first glance, Mesa Verde does not look fragile. From a distance, the cliffs appear solid, unmoving, permanent. The stone walls rise hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. They have endured storms, freezing winters, and centuries of erosion. And carved into those walls are entire villages. Not ruins, not fragments, but complete living spaces. Rooms stacked vertically. Passageways worn smooth by daily life. Ceremonial chambers built deep into the rock. Everything about these dwellings suggests stability, which is why what happened next caught researchers off guard. Because these structures did not fail after being abandoned. They failed after being visited. For centuries, no one entered them. No footsteps disturbed the floors. No weight pressed against the walls. No hands touched the stone. The dwellings weathered time without intervention. But the moment humans returned, not as residents, but as visitors, that balance began to change. At first, the changes were subtle. Hairline cracks, loose mortar, slight shifts in stone. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, nothing that would make someone stop. And that was the problem. Because these homes were never built to handle repetition. They were built for a small number of people, moving carefully within a space they understood. They were not built for thousands of unfamiliar footsteps. Not built for modern access. Not built for repeated entry. And yet, that is exactly what began to happen. People entered. They climbed. They leaned against walls. They passed through spaces that had remained untouched for generations, all in the name of preservation. But preservation requires understanding limits. And at Mesa Verde, those limits were crossed long before anyone realized it. The decision to enter Mesa Verde did not come from curiosity alone. It came from responsibility. When researchers and officials first documented the cliff dwellings, they were already centuries old. Exposed to wind, to rain, to erosion that never stops. From the outside, it appeared only a matter of time before these structures would fail. At the time, doing nothing was seen as the greater risk. So the decision was made to step inside, not to occupy, not to rebuild, but to study, to stabilize, and eventually to share. Archaeologists began clearing debris. Walls were measured. Cracks were recorded. Loose stones were reset. In some areas, supports were added. In others, access paths were created. The logic was simple. If people could see these homes, they would care about them. And if they cared, they would help protect them. Mesa Verde was no longer treated as an abandoned landscape. It became a managed site, a place where history could be safely experienced. At least, that was the expectation. As interest grew, so did access. Ladders were installed to reach alcoves once entered only by residents. Steps were carved to guide movement through narrow passages. Routes were defined. Tours were scheduled. Human presence became routine, not hundreds of years apart, but daily. Season after season, The decision was never framed as a single dramatic choice. There was no moment where someone said, "This is too far." Each step felt reasonable on its own. One ladder to make access safer. One cleared pathway to prevent accidents. One guided tour to control movement. Individually, these choices appeared careful, even protective. But together, they changed the relationship between the dwellings and the people inside them. The cliff homes had once responded only to natural forces. Temperature, moisture, gravity. Now they had to respond to something else. Weight, vibration, repetition. Hundreds of footsteps moving through rooms never designed for traffic. Hands brushing against walls where mortar had already weakened with age. Breath and body heat altering enclosed spaces that once remained still. None of this caused immediate failure. There were no collapses, no dramatic warnings. And that absence of crisis reinforced the belief that the decision had been correct, that access was under control. But the margin for error was always smaller than it appeared, because these homes were never engineered to recover. They could endure time. What they could not endure was being used. And once the decision to enter had been normalized, there was no clear point where stopping felt justified. Not until the consequences could no longer be ignored. At Mesa Verde, human access did not happen all at once. It expanded slowly and methodically, with each step justified as necessary and responsible. What began as limited entry for research and documentation gradually became routine. Paths were defined through spaces that had never been meant to be traveled repeatedly. Vertical ladders were installed to reach alcoves once accessed only by the people who lived there. Stone steps were carved to guide movement through narrow passages and tight corridors. Each modification was small. Each one was practical. And each change made the next step easier to justify. Over time, entire routes were established inside the cliff dwellings themselves. Rooms became passageways, and doorways became choke points. Spaces designed for stillness were turned into spaces of movement. The dwellings were no longer static structures preserved in place. They became corridors. Tour schedules were introduced. Groups were timed. Movement was carefully regulated. But even regulated movement is still movement. Hundreds of visitors passed through rooms never designed to support repeated traffic. Day after day, season after season, footsteps pressed against floors that had remained untouched for centuries. Hands reached out for balance against walls where mortar had already weakened with age. Backpacks brushed against stone surfaces. Bodies leaned where residents had once moved carefully and infrequently. The scale of access was not defined by a single visit. It was defined by repetition. And repetition introduced forces these structures had never faced before. Weight, applied again and again to the same points. Vibration, transmitted through stone with every step. Moisture, carried in on clothing and breath, altering the microenvironments inside enclosed spaces. Heat from human body, slowly changing temperature gradients that had once remained stable. None of this was dramatic. Nothing failed overnight. There were no collapsing walls, no sudden disasters. Instead, the changes were incremental. Mortar loosened over time. Hairline fractures widened. Small shifts became measurable. Not enough to trigger alarm. Not enough to stop access. And because nothing catastrophic happened, access continued. More visitors. More tours. More reliance on the assumption that these structures could adapt. But the cliff dwellings were never engineered systems. They had no tolerance margins, no capacity to redistribute stress. Every stone, every joint, every surface was part of a balance that had only ever worked under one condition: limited use. By turning these homes into destinations, that condition no longer existed. Without realizing it, human presence was no longer an occasional disturbance. It had become the dominant force acting on the structures. This was not vandalism. It was not neglect. It was controlled access. And that made the risk far more difficult to recognize, because nothing looked out of control until the data began to say otherwise. The first signs did not arrive as a single moment of failure. They appeared gradually, and they were easy to overlook. At first, the changes were described as normal aging. Small cracks in stone, mortar loosening between joints, minor shifts in wall that had stood for centuries. Nothing unusual for structures exposed to the elements. But what made researchers pause was not the damage itself. It was the pattern. The wear did not appear evenly across the dwellings. It concentrated along access roads, along stairways, at ladder landings, near doorways where visitors slowed, stopped, or reached out for support. These were not random points of stress. They were points of contact, areas where human movement repeated itself again and again. In reports, the language remained careful. Terms like increased deterioration and accelerated wear began to appear, not as conclusions, but as observations. Preservation teams noted that surfaces once stable were changing faster than expected. Hairline fractures widened within measurable timeframes. Mortar loss increased in high-traffic zones. Stone edges that had remained intact for generations began to soften and break. Still, there was no emergency. The structures were standing. Tours continued. Access remained open. From the outside, everything appeared under control. But internally, assessments were becoming more cautious. Engineers and conservators started asking whether the dwellings were responding to natural forces alone, or whether something else had become part of the equation. What complicated the issue was that human impact did not behave like a single destructive event. It behaved like pressure, constant, predictable, and cumulative. Each visit added weight. Each step added vibration. Each breath altered enclosed spaces, just slightly more. Individually, none of these factors crossed a critical threshold. Together, they began to narrow the margin of safety. And that margin had always been small, because these homes were never designed to absorb stress repeatedly. They had no systems to recover once balance was lost. By the time the concern was formally acknowledged, the question had already shifted. It was no longer whether access caused damage. It was whether access could continue safely at all. That question did not demand an immediate answer, but it changed how every sign was interpreted afterward. Cracks were no longer just cracks. They were indicators. Measurements were no longer routine. They were warnings. And slowly, the idea that human presence might itself be a risk became impossible to ignore. The moment of closure did not come suddenly. It arrived after years of hesitation. By the time officials began discussing restriction, the question was no longer theoretical. It was operational. Could people still be allowed inside without putting the site at risk? For some dwellings, the answer became increasingly difficult to justify. Assessments showed that certain alcoves were no longer responding predictably to stress. Cracks that had once remained stable began to change more quickly than models anticipated. Loose stone above visitor routes raised new concerns, not about preservation alone, but about safety. Because at that point, the risk was no longer limited to the structures themselves. It extended to the people inside them. Nowhere was this more apparent than at Spruce Tree House. Unlike other dwellings, its position beneath a fractured cliff face made it uniquely vulnerable. Rockfall had always been a possibility, but monitoring data showed that conditions were changing. Small shifts in the cliff above suggested instability that could not be reliably mitigated. There was no single collapse, no dramatic failure, just a growing understanding that intervention had reached its limit. In 2015, the decision was made. Spruce Tree House was closed to all interior access. Not partially, not temporarily, completely. For the first time in modern management, one of Mesa Verde's most iconic dwellings could no longer be entered. This was not a symbolic act. It was an admission that despite decades of study, stabilization, and controlled access, the site could not safely support continued human presence. And the implications went further than a single closure. Once one ancestral home was deemed too risky to enter, every other dwelling had to be reevaluated. Access routes were shortened. Visitor numbers were reduced. Entire sections were sealed. What had once been framed as preservation through access was quietly replaced by preservation through exclusion. The language changed, no longer about what visitors could see, but about what could no longer be allowed. This was the point where the underlying contradiction became impossible to ignore. These were ancestral homes connected to living descendants. And yet, their continued survival now required distance. Not reverence, not interpretation, but absence. The closure was not an ending. It was a line. A recognition that the presence meant to protect had become the pressure that forced the door shut. After the closures, Mesa Verde did not fall silent. It became quieter. Access was reduced, but the site remained active. Preservation teams continued monitoring. Engineers reassessed stress points. Policies were rewritten. The focus shifted from opening spaces to limiting exposure. Visitors could still see the dwellings, but increasingly, they saw them from a distance. Overlooks replaced interiors. Barriers replaced ladders. Interpretation replaced entry. This change was not framed as loss. It was framed as responsibility. The language used by managers became more precise. Not what could be experienced, but what had to be protected. And behind that shift was an uncomfortable acknowledgement. That access, even when carefully controlled, had consequences. For the first time, preservation was defined not by intervention, but by restraint. This raised questions that could not be answered by engineering alone. Because Mesa Verde is not an abandoned site in the cultural sense. It is tied to living communities whose descendants continue to identify these dwellings as ancestral homes. For those communities, closure carried a different meaning. It was not simply about safety or conservation. It was about boundaries. Who is allowed to enter a space built by ancestors? Who decide when that entry ends? Federal agencies now found themselves navigating more than geology and structural stability. They were navigating ethics. Consultation with descendant community became more visible. Language shifted away from discovery and toward respect. Not every question had an answer, but the direction was clear. Mesa Verde would no longer be managed as a place to be entered freely. It would be managed as a place to be approached carefully. Seen, but not touched. Understood, but not occupied. In this new framework, distance was no longer a failure. It was a form of protection. And absence was no longer neglect. It was recognition. Recognition that some places survive best when humans step back. Mesa Verde still stands. The walls remain. The rooms endure. The cliff faces hold. From a distance, very little appears to have changed. But the relationship has. What was once open is now approached cautiously. What was once entered is now observed. And what was once treated as something to be accessed is now understood as something to be respected. The unanswered question is not whether the closures were justified. The data address that. The question is deeper. When we encounter places like this, places built by people whose descendants are still here, What does responsibility actually mean? Is preservation about allowing entry so that people can see and feel connected? Or is it about restraint, accepting that some connections require distance? At Mesa Verde, the answer was not found in a single policy or a single decision. It emerged slowly as limits were tested and consequences accumulated. The result was not discovery, it was humility, an acknowledgement that even careful intentions can carry weight, that even controlled access can cross a line, and that some places do not need us inside them to be understood. They need us to listen, to observe, and sometimes to step back. Because the true measure of how far humans should go is not defined by what we can enter, but by what we are willing to leave untouched.